The night sky over Siberia was always quiet. There were no big cities nearby, no loud traffic, no crowds, just frozen land, tall dark trees, and stars that looked close enough to touch. The people who lived in the small villages nearby were used to silence. They were used to cold winds and empty roads. They were not used to what happened on the night of March 4th. It started as a sound, a low, deep hum that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The ground shook slightly, like a sleeping giant turning in its sleep. Dogs barked. Birds flew out of the trees in great black clouds. Old men stepped out of their homes and looked up at the sky with confused faces. And then they saw it. A ship. Not a plane, not a meteor, a ship. It was enormous. It was bigger than anything human hands had ever built. It moved slowly across the sky, not like a falling rock, but like something heavy being lowered by invisible hands. Its surface was dark gray and covered in strange patterns that seemed to glow faintly in places, like dying embers in a fire. Smoke or gas poured from several sections along its body. Parts of it were clearly broken. Whole sections of the hull had caved in. One end of the ship looked like it had been melted by something terribly hot. It came down in the open tundra, about 60 kilometers from the nearest town. It did not crash violently. It landed with a long, grinding, terrible sound that lasted almost 4 minutes. The ground cracked beneath it. Ice shattered. Snow flew outward in every direction, like a white storm. And then it was still. The ship was 3 kilometers long. By morning, satellites from 12 different countries had already taken thousands of photographs. Military channels around the world were buzzing with voices. Governments called emergency meetings before the sun had even fully risen. The images were shared, studied, argued over, and shared again. Everyone had the same question. Everyone already knew the answer was going to change everything. The United Nations put together a rapid response team within 18 hours. It was one of the fastest decisions the UN had ever made in its entire history. The team had scientists, soldiers, engineers, doctors, and communications experts. They were flown into Siberia on military transport planes before most of the world had even finished reading the morning news. Dr. Dae-soo was on the second plane. He was 41 years old, Korean, and one of the best aerospace engineers alive. He had spent the last 15 years designing propulsion systems for deep space probes. He was quiet by nature. He did not like long speeches or dramatic moments. He liked problems. When his phone had rung at 2 in the morning with the call to join the team, he had not panicked. He had simply put on his glasses, made a cup of coffee, packed a bag, and left. He sat near the window of the transport plane with a tablet on his lap, already looking at the satellite images. His colleague and friend, Dr. Yuna, sat beside him. She was a physicist who specialized in energy systems and radiation fields. She was 36, sharp-eyed, and had a habit of tapping her fingers on her knee when she was thinking hard. She was tapping very hard right now. "The hull damage on the rear section," she said, pointing at the image on his tablet. "That is not from the landing." "No," Dae-soo agreed. "That happened before, long before. So it was already broken when it came here." "Yes." She looked at the image for another long moment. Someone threw it away. He just looked out the window at the white land below. When the team arrived at the site, the sheer size of the ship was impossible to fully understand until you were standing next to it. Photographs had not prepared any of them. Dae-soo stepped out of the transport vehicle and just stood there in the cold, looking up. The ship rose above him like a mountain. Its surface up close was covered in fine lines and grooves that ran in complex patterns, almost like writing, almost like circuitry. In some places the metal, if it even was metal, had a faint bluish shimmer that did not come from any reflection. It came from inside. Colonel Inho was already there when Desu arrived. He was a military man, 50 years old, broad-shouldered, with a face that had seen too many cold mornings and too many long nights. He did not smile often, but he was fair and he was smart. And Desu had worked with him before on classified government projects. They shook hands without much ceremony. "Any signals?" Desu asked. "Nothing since it landed," Inho said. "No life signs, no movement. It is completely dark inside, as far as we can tell. The radiation levels around it are strange, but not immediately dangerous. Our sensors cannot fully read what type of radiation it is." "That is because our sensors were not built to read it," Yuna said, walking up beside them with her own scanner already in her hand. She pointed it toward the hull and watched the numbers change in ways she had never seen before. She raised an eyebrow. "Interesting." They spent the first 2 days simply walking around the ship, mapping it, measuring it, taking samples from the outer hull, where pieces had broken off and lay in the snow like fallen walls. The material was unlike any known element. It was heavy, but not brittle. It absorbed heat instead of conducting it. Under a microscope, it showed a structure so complex and layered that 3 different scientists gave 3 completely different descriptions of what they were looking at. On the 3rd day, the message came. It arrived on every major communications frequency at once. It was in dozens of languages, including every major human language, which was itself deeply unsettling. The message was short. It was from something that called itself the Galactic Conclave. The tone of the message was the tone of someone explaining a rule to a child they do not expect to fully understand. The message said that the vessel was Conclave property. It had been decommissioned and disposed of according to standard Conclave procedure. Earth had been selected as the disposal site because it was remote, undeveloped, and posed no risk of interference. Humanity was instructed to move away from the site immediately. Any attempt to touch, study, enter, or claim the vessel would be considered an act of aggression against the Conclave, and would be dealt with accordingly. The message ended with a list of consequences that grew increasingly severe. It read less like a warning and more like a promise. The UN Security Council met for 6 hours. There was shouting, there were long silences, there were men in expensive suits saying words like sovereignty and protocol and measured response. There were others saying words like threat and weapons and retreat. Desu was not in that meeting. He was still at the site, standing in the snow, looking at the ship. Yuna was beside him. Inho stood a few steps back, reading the message transcript on a printed sheet of paper, his face giving nothing away. "They called us remote and undeveloped," Yuna said. "They left their broken ship in our backyard," Inho said. "And now they are telling us not to touch it." Desu looked at the ship for a long time. He looked at the cracked sections, the melted plating, the broken systems leaking faint light into the cold air. He thought about every problem he had ever been handed and told was unsolvable. He thought about what he had done with each of them. He turned to Yuna. "How long do you think it would take to get inside?" She looked at the hull, thinking, tapping her knee with her fingers. "With the right tools? Maybe a week." Desu nodded once. "Then we start tomorrow." Nobody argued. Nobody asked for permission. They simply went back to their tents, made their plans, and went to sleep. Outside, the ship sat in the dark Siberian tundra, broken and abandoned, and very, very large. It had no idea what was coming. Aliens dumped their abandoned, failed ship on Earth. Humanity forged it into a weapon. Part 2. Cracking the Impossible. The first drill broke in 40 seconds. It was not a cheap drill. It was a military-grade titanium-tipped bore drill that had been used to cut through reinforced concrete, hardened steel, and compressed rock formations. It had never failed this fast. The bit simply crumbled against the ship's hull, like a pencil being pushed into a wall. The engineer holding it stared at the broken tip at his hand, with a look of pure disbelief. Daesu was not surprised. He had expected this. "We are not cutting through it," he said calmly. "We are looking for a door." That took 4 days. The ship was 3 kilometers long and nearly half a kilometer wide. Its surface had thousands of panels, seams, grooves, and markings. Finding an actual entrance meant studying every centimeter of the exterior in freezing temperatures while wearing heavy protective gear. Teams worked in rotating shifts, around the clock, with lights set up across the hull like a construction site in the middle of nowhere. The camp around the ship had grown rapidly. More tents, more vehicles, more people arriving every day from different countries, different fields, different languages. The site had started to look less like a research camp and more like a small city. Yuna found the door. It was not obvious. It did not look like a door. It was a section of the hull near the mid-left side of the ship, lower to the ground than most of the surrounding panels. The grooves around it ran in a slightly different pattern. The faint glow that came from inside the ship was a tiny bit brighter here. Yuna had been scanning the hull with a custom sensor she had modified herself, tuning it to detect variations in the ship's internal energy field. When she walked past this section, the reading jumped. She marked it, called Daesu, and within an hour, they had a full team assembled. The door did not have a handle. It did not have a button or a keypad or any VISO mechanism. It was just a panel that responded to energy. Yuna spent an entire day experimenting with different frequencies, different outputs, different angles. She used equipment, she used improvised tools, she used her own scanner, modified in 3 different ways. Finally, late on the evening of the 5th day, she found the right frequency. A low harmonic pulse at a very specific wavelength caused the panel to shudder, pull inward silently, and slide aside. The inside of the ship was dark, and cold, and enormous. He walked slowly, his helmet light cutting through the black air. The corridor was tall enough that he felt very small. The walls had the same grooved patterns as the outside, but here they were finer, more detailed, almost decorative. Some panels were completely dark. Others had a faint dead glow, like a phone screen left on its lowest setting, with almost no battery left. The air was stale, and had a faint metallic smell mixed with something he could not name. Over the next 2 weeks, teams mapped the interior section by section. The ship had multiple levels, hundreds of rooms, enormous open chambers that may have been storage bays or hangars, long corridors that ran for hundreds of meters, and at the very center, a reactor room the size of a sports stadium. The reactor was fractured. It was not destroyed, but it was badly damaged. The core, a dense dark sphere about 8 meters in diameter, surrounded by rings of crystalline structures, had cracked along one side. The energy it had once produced was leaking out in slow pulses that explained the radiation readings outside. It was like a cracked engine block. The machine still existed. It still had potential. But something had hit it hard enough to break its heart. Taeyong arrived on day 19. He was 30 years old and had the look of someone who had never fully left university. He carried too many bags, wore the same jacket 3 days in a row, and had a tendency to stop walking mid-step when a thought hit him. He was a propulsion specialist who had written papers on theoretical alien drive systems as a side project that most of his colleagues had politely ignored. He was brought in because Daesu had read those papers and thought they were not theoretical at all. Taeyeon stood in the reactor room for almost an hour without saying a word. He walked around the cracked core slowly, looking at it from every angle. He stood on a raised platform to look at it from above. He pressed his hand gently against one of the crystalline rings and closed his eyes like he was listening. Then he sat down on the floor, cross-legged, pulled out a notebook, an actual paper notebook, and started writing. "Well?" Daesu asked after another 20 minutes. Taeyong did not look up. It did not fail because of the crack. The crack happened because it had already failed. Something in the fuel compression cycle collapsed first. Probably a resonance error. The core fractured under the pressure of a system that was already dying. He paused, still writing. "It is actually fixable." Daesu looked at the cracked core. "Fixable how?" "The resonance problem is a math problem. Someone designed this with assumptions about how the compression cycle should behave. Or maybe they were right once, and then conditions changed, and nobody updated the model." He finally looked up. "I can write a corrected model. The question is whether we can build the components to match it." "We can build anything," Daesu said. Taeyong almost smiled. "I believe you." The conclave sent a second message on day 22. This one was shorter and colder than the first. It had clearly been sent because their observation systems, whatever those were, had detected human activity inside the ship. The message repeated its earlier warning. It added that a conclave inspection team would be arriving in the solar system within one standard conclave year to confirm that the vessel had not been tampered with. In-ho read the message out loud to the senior team in the main briefing tent. When he finished, there was a short silence. "How long is a conclave year?" someone asked. A linguist at the back of the room looked up from her translation notes. Her name was Bora. She was young, barely 28, and had been studying the conclave language for 3 weeks straight, with almost no sleep. She had already cracked a significant portion of the written symbols found inside the ship. "Based on the astronomical references in the first message," she said, "approximately 14 Earth months." 14 months. In-ho folded his hands on the table. "Then we have 14 months. To do what?" someone asked. In-ho looked at Daesu. Daesu looked at Taeyang. Taeyang was already back in his notebook. "To finish," Daesu said simply. The pace of work doubled overnight. More engineers were flown in. Factories in 6 countries were quietly redirected to produce components based on specifications that Taeyong and Yuna were sending out almost daily. The components were strange. They were nothing like standard aerospace parts. But the factories made them because they were told to, and because the people giving the specifications clearly knew exactly what they needed. Mireille joined the team on day 30. She was a materials scientist, calm and precise, with short hair and a steady voice. She had been studying the samples taken from the hull since the very beginning, working remotely from a lab in Seoul. When she arrived at the site in person, she spent her first hour walking the exterior of the ship with her eyes half closed, running her fingers along the surface in long, slow strokes. "It is not dead," she announced to Daesu that evening. "What do you mean?" "The hull material. It looks degraded. The conclave clearly thought it was beyond use, but it is not degraded. It is dormant." She pulled out her tablet and showed him a series of microscopic images. "The structure is still fully intact at the molecular level. It has gone into a kind of low-energy sleep state. I think it did this automatically when the reactor cracked. A protection response." She zoomed in on one of the images. "If we can produce the right ionic frequency signal, I believe the hull will reactivate." "And if it reactivates?" "Then it will not just be as strong as it was originally." She looked at him steadily. "It will be stronger, because it has been in compression for what I estimate is several hundred years. The dormant state has actually increased the density of the molecular bonds." Daesu stared at the image. The conclave threw away a ship that became better while it was broken. Mireille nodded once. They did not know what they had. Outside, the ship sat in the Siberian cold, dark and enormous and still, but it was not as dead as it looked. And the people working around it and inside it, with their notebooks and their scanners and their factories running overnight, were starting to understand what it truly was. Not a wreck. A gift. And they were just getting started. "Aliens," dumped their abandoned, failed ship on Earth. Humanity forged it into a weapon. Part 3. The Forging. By the end of the 3rd month, the camp around the ship had a name. People had started calling it Sabyok. It was a Korean word that meant the first light before dawn. Nobody had officially named it. It had just started appearing in reports, in messages, in the conversations of engineers eating dinner in the meal tent. It spread the way natural things spread, because it fit. Because standing in that frozen field at 4 a.m, watching lights blaze through the windows of the alien hull, while dozens of workers moved around it, like ants around something enormous and alive, it really did look like something beginning. The world knew something was happening. They did not know exactly what. The UN had released a careful, very boring statement about an international scientific study of the vessel. It said very little, and answered no real questions. But satellite images were not classified. Journalists had long lenses. People on the internet were very good at counting vehicles and estimating the size of things. And the conclave's original warning message had been intercepted and leaked within 48 hours of its arrival. Humanity knew. Governments knew. The public knew. And the feeling spreading across the world was not fear. It was something much more interesting. Inside the ship, Taeyong had not slept properly in 11 days. His corrected model for the fuel compression cycle had been finished in the 4th week. It had then been checked by 7 other engineers from 4 different countries, all of whom had come to the same conclusion. It was correct. Not approximately correct. Not correct with adjustments needed. Simply, cleanly, completely correct. The model described a compression method that was in some ways simpler than what the conclave had originally designed, but it was far more stable. It removed the resonance problem entirely by approaching the energy cycle from a different mathematical direction. One of the checking engineers, an older German physicist, had looked at the model for a long time and then said quietly, "They were almost there. They just kept doing it the same wrong way." Taeyong had nodded. They never questioned their own starting point. The reactor work was dangerous. The fractured core was leaking slow radiation that their suits handled, but that still made everyone careful. Repairs had to be done in short shifts. The crystalline rings surrounding the core had to be removed one by one, studied, repaired where needed, and reinstalled according to Taeyong's new specifications. Some rings were beyond repair and had to be replaced entirely with human-made substitutes built to match the alien specifications as closely as possible. The human-made rings were not perfect copies. They could not be. The original material was impossible to fully reproduce. But Taeyong had built the new model to be tolerant of small imperfections, and the substitutes worked within those tolerances. In some cases, the human-made components were actually more uniform than the original alien ones, which showed signs of being handcrafted with slight variations between pieces. They built this by hand, Mireille had said one afternoon, studying one of the original rings under a magnifier. Individually, each one slightly different from the others. So did we, Taeyong had replied, but we were more consistent. She had looked at him for a moment, and then laughed, which was unusual for her. We were more consistent, she repeated, as if the idea pleased her in a way she had not expected. Mireille's own work was moving quickly. She had tested the ionic frequency theory extensively, and was now ready to apply it to the hull at full scale. The process required generating the right signal across the entire exterior surface simultaneously, which meant setting up an array of emitters placed at specific intervals around the ship. Building and positioning those emitters took 3 weeks. When it was finally done, Mireille did a final check of every emitter herself, walking the full perimeter of the ship alone in the early morning cold before anyone else was awake. She activated the array on a Tuesday morning with the full senior team watching from a safe distance. The effect was not explosive. It was not dramatic in the way that movies would have made it. The hull of the ship shuddered once, very slightly, like a person taking a deep breath after a long sleep. And then it began to change. The dull, degraded surface slowly shifted. The color deepened. The faint dead patches brightened. The material seemed to pull itself tighter, the way skin pulls tight when it is cold and then warmed. Over the course of about 4 minutes, the entire hull transformed. When it was done, the ship looked different. Not new exactly, but alive. Dense, ready. In-ho had been standing beside Dae-su during the process. When it finished, In-ho turned to him and said, "It looks angry." Dae-su studied the hull. "Good," he said. Junho had arrived in the second month, and had been largely quiet ever since. He was not young. He was 45, stocky, with broad hands and permanently paint-stained fingers from a hobby of building detailed scale models. He had a background in electromagnetic weapons research for the Korean Defense Ministry, and had spent the last decade working on theoretical energy weapon systems that his superiors had consistently described as too complicated and too expensive to develop. He was not bitter about this. He was patient. He had always believed that the right moment would come eventually. He had spent his first 6 weeks simply studying the ship's weapon systems, which were located in a series of large rooms along the upper middle section of the vessel. The systems were complicated, layered, and in poor condition. Several of the weapons had been completely destroyed. Others had failed in ways that were clearly related to the reactor fracture. They had simply lost power and shut down. A few were in surprisingly good shape. Junho did not try to restore them. He took them apart. He took apart every weapon he could access, and laid out every component on the floor in organized rows. He photographed everything. He cataloged everything. He spent days doing nothing but looking at the pieces and thinking. Engineers who walked through his workspace sometimes asked if they could help. He always politely said no. Then he started building. He combined alien power conduits, the channels through which the ship's energy had flowed to its weapons, with electromagnetic coil designs from his own previous research. He had always believed that human electromagnetic theory was more advanced than most governments gave it credit for. Placed alongside alien energy channeling technology, the combination produced something that neither side could have created alone. The weapon he built did not have a name yet. It was a long, smooth barrel, mounted on a heavy rotating base, fed by conduits running back to the repaired reactor. It could draw and focus an enormous amount of energy into a single directed beam. The beam could be adjusted in width, intensity, and duration. At minimum output, it could disable electronics across a wide area. At maximum output, nobody yet wanted to calculate what it could do, because the number was uncomfortable. Junho explained this to the senior team in a flat, matter-of-fact voice, standing in front of a whiteboard with equations on it, still with paint on his fingers. When he finished, the room was quiet for a moment. "How many can we build?" Dae-su asked. "On this ship? 8, maybe 10. He paused. "With modifications to the conduit routing I have been planning, possibly 12. Dae-su nodded slowly. "Build 12. The name for the ship came the same week, from nobody in particular and everybody at once. Someone put it in a report as a placeholder. Someone else liked it and used it again. Within 3 days, every person at the site was using it. The ship was Chisong, Earthstar. It was simple, and it was honest. And it carried something in it that everyone understood without needing to explain. This was not an alien ship anymore. It had not been an alien ship for a long time. The Conclave's deadline was now 8 months away. Taeyang's reactor came online for the first time on a cold Thursday morning in the 7th month. The test was short, just a 5-minute low-power activation to check stability. But when the reactor lit up and held its output steady, and the power readings across the ship began to climb, the whole team stood in the control room they had built inside the vessel, and watched the screens and nobody said a word. Then Bora, who had been there since the beginning, translating the ship's internal systems into readable interfaces, said quietly, "She's breathing." Tae-Yang looked to his screens. Every reading was inside his projected parameters, not close to the parameters. As if the ship had been waiting all along for someone to fix it the right way. He sat down heavily in his chair, and put his face in his hands. Not from sadness, from the release of 11 months of quiet, steady, relentless pressure, finally lifting all at once. Nobody pretended not to notice, and nobody said anything. They just let him have that moment, because he had earned it more than any of them. Chi-Song was alive, and she was ready. Aliens dumped their abandoned, failed ship on Earth. Humanity forged it into a weapon. Part 4. First Contact, Second Thoughts. The Conclave fleet arrived 2 weeks early. They did not announce themselves. There was no second message, no warning transmission, no diplomatic signal. One day the space beyond Mars was empty. The next morning, it was not. 3 large vessels had simply appeared, sitting in a neat formation at a distance that was close enough to be seen by Earth's deep space observatories, and far enough to suggest they did not yet feel the need to come closer. The observatories reported the sighting at 6 in the morning. By 7, Inho had the report in his hands. By 8, Daesu was on a call with the UN. By 9, every major government on Earth was holding some version of an emergency meeting. By 10, Inho had walked across the site to find Daesu already standing beside the Chi-Song, looking up at her, with a mug of coffee in his hand and a calm expression on his face. "They came early," Inho said. "They wanted to catch us unprepared," Daesu replied. He took a slow drink of his coffee. "They miscalculated." The Chi-Song was ready. Not barely ready, not almost ready, fully ready. Taeyong's reactor had now been running stable tests for 5 weeks. Mirei's hull was holding its reactivated state perfectly. Junho's 12 weapon systems had all been tested at low output and performed exactly as expected. Bora and her linguistics team had translated enough of the ship's internal systems that they could operate every major function from the control room, which they had equipped with human-built screens and interfaces connected to the ship's own network. The ship could move. The ship could fight. The ship could do both at the same time. The question of what to do next was not a simple one. The UN spent 3 days in very loud and very serious debate. Some nations wanted to open communications with the Conclave fleet immediately. Some wanted to retreat from the ship and show good faith. Some wanted to move the Chi-Song to a more defensible position, though nobody could quite agree on where that would be. A few voices wanted to simply power the Chi-Song up in full view of the Conclave fleet and let them draw their own conclusions. Daesu was not part of those debates. He was at the site, working. He was always working. On the 4th day, the Conclave fleet made a move. One of the 3 ships separated from the formation and moved closer, coming to rest near the orbit of the moon. It was a deliberate act, close enough to be a clear message, far enough to claim it was not an aggressive one. Then they sent a transmission. The transmission came through on every frequency simultaneously. It was addressed to all Earth governments. The voice was smooth, formal, and unhurried. It spoke first in its own language, and then repeated itself in 6 human languages, one after another, including Korean, English, Mandarin, and Arabic. The Conclave representative identified himself as Envoy Vorath. He said that the Conclave had observed unauthorized activity inside a piece of Conclave property. He said that the 3 vessels currently present were an inspection and enforcement delegation, not a military force, and that their presence was entirely lawful under Conclave space law. He said that Earth had 72 hours to stand down from the vessel, remove all personnel and equipment, and allow a Conclave team to conduct a full inspection. After inspection, The vessel would either be formally repossessed, or, if damage had been done to Conclave property, appropriate measures would be taken. He said this in the same tone a building inspector might use to explain a violation to a homeowner. Calm, certain, slightly bored. The UN went back into debate. More shouting, more long silences. Dae-Soo called a meeting of his own team that evening. The people in that meeting were the same people who had been at the site from the beginning. Yuna, Taeyong, Mirei, Junho, Bora, Inho, and a few others who had been part of this from the early weeks. They sat around a folding table inside the Chisong's main control room. The ship's internal lights, now fully functional, gave the room a steady blue-white glow. It was warm inside. It had not always been warm inside. 72 hours, Bora said. She had the full transmission transcript in front of her. Space law, repossession, appropriate measures. They speak to us as if we signed their laws. We did not, Inho said. We did not, she agreed. Yuna was tapping her knee. She had her own reasons for what she was feeling. She had spent over a year of her life inside this ship, learning its bones, fixing its blood. The idea of handing it back, or worse, of some conclave team walking through it and dismantling everything they had built, was not something she could think about calmly. We should respond, she said. And say what? Someone asked. Everyone looked at Dae-Soo. He had been quiet through the whole conversation. He was looking at the main screen, which showed a live feed from the external cameras. The Siberian landscape outside, the stars above it. Somewhere beyond those stars, 3 large ships were waiting for an answer. We say the truth, he said. We found an abandoned vessel on our planet. We repaired it, we improved it, we are keeping it. He paused, and we say it plainly. 1 sentence. No apologies, no explanations. That will not go over well, Inho said. It does not need to go over well, Dae-Soo replied. It needs to be clear. The transmission from Earth went out the next morning. It was sent on behalf of the international team at the site, not on behalf of any single government. It had taken Dae-Soo 40 minutes to write, and several people had wanted to change it. He had listened to all of them and changed nothing. The message was 7 words. You left it here, it is ours. The silence from the Conclave fleet lasted 11 hours. During those 11 hours, the Chisong completed her final pre-flight checks. Taeyong ran the reactor at 60% output, the highest it had been taken since the repair. It held perfectly. The ship's movement systems, thrusters designed for deep space travel, had been tested in short low-altitude burns over the previous weeks. Dae-Soo had flown her 3 times himself, and each time the feeling of sitting at the controls of something this large and this powerful, moving through the air, had been unlike anything in his life. The Conclave fleet moved when the 11 hours were up. All 3 ships advanced. They crossed the moon's orbit and came inward, slowing to a stop at a distance of roughly 200,000 kilometers from Earth. At that range, they were clearly visible in Earth's night sky. 3 new bright points of light that millions of people were watching from their windows, their rooftops, their phones, and their telescopes. Vorat's second transmission was shorter than the first. 72 hours had become 12. The deadline was no longer for evacuation. It was for a full and complete surrender of the vessel. The tone had changed. It was no longer the tone of a building inspector. It was the tone of someone who had decided to stop being patient. At the end of the transmission, as a demonstration of the Conclave's capabilities, one of the 3 ships fired a single shot, a plasma burst. It traveled away from Earth, out into open space, and struck a small asteroid sitting about 100,000 kilometers to the side of the fleet. The asteroid, roughly the size of a city block, evaporated. Not exploded, evaporated. One moment it was there. The next moment it was a rapidly expanding cloud of superheated gas. The transmission ended without another word. On Earth, Several governments immediately began drafting statements of compliance. Old fear was fast and strong. Daesu watched the asteroid footage twice on the control room screen. Then he got up, walked to the crew station at the front of the ship, sat down, and strapped in. Through the front cameras, he could see the Siberian sky. He pressed the internal communications panel. Taeyong, take us to 70%. 70%, yes. Taeyong's voice came back. There was the faintest edge of excitement in it, buried under his usual calm. Junho, weapon systems to standby. Standby, Junho confirmed. His voice gave nothing away. Bora's voice came through next, without being called. Outgoing broadcast ready. All frequencies, all languages. Send it when we're airborne, Daesu said. Inho was standing behind him. He put a hand briefly on the back of Daesu's seat, which was the closest thing to encouragement that Inho had ever expressed, and then strapped himself into the secondary seat, without a word. The Chisong rose slowly from the Siberian tundra. Her thrusters pushed gently at first, and then more firmly. The ground fell away. The research camp grew small below them. The white plains of Siberia spread out. The sky darkened from blue to black in under 2 minutes as she climbed through the atmosphere with a steadiness and power that was almost quiet, almost gentle, as if the ship knew she was finally doing what she was made to do. Bora's broadcast went out across every frequency as the Chisong broke into open space. You are in our solar system without an invitation. You have 1 hour to withdraw. We will not repeat this message. In the Conclave fleet, Envoy Vorath received the transmission, and then received the visual feed from his own sensors, showing a ship that should not have been able to move, moving. He stared at the data for a moment, and then very quietly said something to his crew in his own language. It did not translate perfectly, but it was close to, "That is not possible." His tactical officer ran a scan of the approaching vessel and handed him the report. Vorath read it. He set it down. The ship coming toward them was not simply repaired. It was not the battered, broken vessel that had been abandoned on that primitive rock. It was different in dozens of measurable ways. The hull density was outside any parameters in their database. The reactor output was reading higher than the original design specifications, and the weapon signatures coming from the vessel were completely unidentified. The computer could not find a match in any known weapons catalog. Vorath looked at his fleet commander. They'd built something new. His fleet commander said nothing. She was watching the approaching ship on her own screen, and her face had the very specific expression of someone who has made an assumption and just discovered it was wrong. Vorath opened a channel to the Earth vessel. His voice, when it came out, was still formal, but it was no longer bored. This is Envoy Vorath of the Galactic Conclave. You are approaching a Conclave enforcement fleet. Stand down and identify your intentions. The response came from a calm male voice, direct, no ceremony. Our intention is to give you the hour we promised. After that, we will help you leave. Vorath closed the channel. He sat very still for a moment. Then he looked at his fleet commander and said something that was not in any official Conclave protocol document. What exactly did we throw away? Neither of them had an answer. Alayans dumped their abandoned failed ship on Earth. Humanity forged it into a weapon. Part 5. The Message. The hour passed slowly. Inside the Chisong, nobody spoke much. The control room was full of people doing their jobs, running checks, watching screens, monitoring outputs. But the conversations were short and practical. A reading, a number, a confirmation. Nobody made jokes. Nobody talked about what might happen next. They just worked. Because working was the thing they knew how to do, and it was the thing that had brought them here. And right now, it was the only thing that made sense. Daesu sat at the front controls. He watched the Conclave fleet on the main screen. 3 ships, large, well-armed by any measure. Each one built by a civilization that had been traveling among the stars for longer than human civilization had been writing things down. They had technology that Earth could not yet fully understand. They had weapons that could turn asteroids into gas. They had a political system that governed 100 worlds, and had never once considered that a species like humanity, young, loud, messy, and very determined, might one day push back. They had also made a mistake. A single, simple, enormously consequential mistake. They had left their ship on the wrong planet. With 20 minutes left in the hour, Vorath opened a channel again. His voice was different this time, not warm. The conclave did not seem to do warm, but more careful, more measured, like someone who has just put down a very heavy thing and is reconsidering how they were carrying it. Earth vessel, he said. We would like to discuss the situation. Desu looked at Bora, who was monitoring all transmissions from her station. She gave him a small nod. He pressed the response key. Discuss, he said. There was a brief pause. The vessel you are operating was conclave property. We acknowledge that proper disposal procedure required greater consideration of the destination site. We are prepared to discuss compensation arrangements. Desu leaned back. He said nothing for a moment. Inho from the seat behind him spoke quietly. They are apologizing without saying sorry. They are testing, Bora said in an equally quiet voice. They want to see if an apology is enough to get the ship back. Desu pressed the response key again. The vessel is ours. We are not discussing its ownership. We are discussing your presence in our solar system, which requires an invitation that you do not have. Another pause. Longer this time. Earth is not a recognized sovereign space power, Vorath replied. Under conclave charter, systems without recognized status are open space and do not require approach authorization. Then recognize us, Desu said. The channel went quiet. For minutes, Taeyang's voice came through the internal comms. Reactor steady at 70%. All systems nominal. I can take us to 90 on your word. Hold at 70, Desu said. Then after a pause, but thank you, Taeyang. Of course, Taeyang said. The hour expired. Desu pressed the broadcast key. Your hour is complete. Please begin withdrawing from this solar system. Vorath's response came fast this time. Earth vessel, we must advise you that hostile action against a conclave enforcement fleet carries consequences that extend well beyond this single engagement. You are representing your entire species in this moment. We ask you to consider that carefully. Desu considered it for about 4 seconds. We have considered it, he said. We considered it for the entire year we spent rebuilding your discarded ship. Begin your withdrawal. What happened next happened in about 30 seconds. The lead conclave ship fired. Not a warning shot this time. A direct shot, aimed at the Chisong. It was a fast, focused plasma beam. The same type of weapon that had evaporated the asteroid. It was a killing shot. It was meant to end the conversation, and the ship, and everyone inside it in a single moment. Junho had been watching their targeting systems for 11 minutes. He redirected the shot. Not with a shield, not with evasion, with mathematics. Junho had spent weeks studying the Conclave's energy weapon type from the samples and systems data Bora's team had translated out of the ship's own databases. He understood how it worked. He understood its trajectory physics. And he had designed a system that could intercept such a beam and redirect its path using a precisely timed counterpulse from one of the Chisong's own weapon systems. The plasma beam hit the counterpulse, bent, and swept back across space in a wide curving arc that passed close enough to the lead conclave ship to completely fry its forward sensor array. The ship went partially blind instantly. Its shields had not been raised because Vorath had not expected to need them. He had expected to fire once and watch the primitive vessel vaporize. The Chisong had not been touched. A long silence fell across every open channel. Daesu let it sit for a moment. Then he pressed broadcast. That was a redirection, he said clearly. Not a counterattack. We did not fire back. We simply moved your shot. He paused. We can have this conversation again if you want. But the result will be the same. And the next one may not be redirected as gently. Withdraw. Now. The Conclave fleet took 16 minutes to make its decision. Nobody on the Chisong said a word during those 16 minutes. They watched the fleet. They breathed. Taeyang kept one hand on the reactor controls. Junho sat at his weapons station with complete stillness. Mireille, who had no station in the control room, had come up to watch and stood in the back with her arms folded, her eyes on the screen. Then the fleet began to move. Slowly at first, cautiously, the way a large animal backs away from something it has just decided it does not want to engage with. All three ships turned and began pushing outward. They did not broadcast anything. They did not explain themselves. They simply moved, and they kept moving, and within 40 minutes they had passed the orbit of Mars again, and within 3 hours they were gone from every sensor Earth had. The control room erupted. It was not a quiet professional eruption. It was genuine, complete, unguarded human noise, shouting, laughing, people grabbing each other by the shoulders, Bora making a sound that she would later deny was a shriek, Taeyang dropping his face into his hands again, and then immediately raising it, and grinning so wide it looked like it hurt. Even Inho, who had been maintaining a composed expression for the entire engagement, let out one short, hard breath that was the closest he had come to crying in 20 years. Daesu sat at the controls for a moment longer. He looked at the now empty space on the screen where the Conclave fleet had been. He thought about the year that had led to this moment, the first drill that had broken in 40 seconds, Yuna finding the door, Taeyang sitting cross-legged on the reactor room floor with his notebook, Mireille walking the hull in the cold before dawn, Junho in his rows of parts and his patient hands, Bora barely sleeping, surrounded by alien symbols, turning them into something readable. Inho, standing in the snow, reading the Conclave's first message with a face like stone. All of it had happened because a civilization that thought itself superior had looked at Earth and seen nothing worth worrying about. He unstrapped himself, stood up, and turned to face the room. Everyone was still talking, still laughing, still processing. He waited until the noise settled just enough to be heard. "Take us home," he said. The celebration continued all the way back down through the atmosphere. The news reached the world fast. The UN was informed before the Chisong had even fully landed. Within the hour, every major broadcast in every major country was covering the story. The Conclave fleet had retreated. Earth had faced an enforcement action, and the enforcement had not worked. The primitive species on the remote undeveloped planet had repaired an abandoned alien warship, improved it, taken it into space, and redirected the Conclave's own weapon back at them. The world did not know quite how to feel about this for about 2 days. And then it settled. And the feeling it settled on was something that did not come from anger or from fear or from pride exactly. It came from something deeper than all three of those things. It came from the long and complicated and very human feeling of having been underestimated for a very long time and finally, cleanly, undeniably proving the mistake. Mireille sat on the roof of the old research dome that night, the one that had been the first building put up when the team had arrived over a year ago. The tundra was dark around her. The lights of the now large camp spread out below. The stars were the same stars they had always been, but they felt different, less indifferent. Taeyang came up through the hatch with 2 mugs of tea and sat down beside her without asking. He handed her one. She took it. They sat quietly for a while. "They will come back eventually," Mireille said. "Yes," Taeyang agreed. "With more ships, or with diplomats?" He thought about it. "Diplomats," he said. "They are proud, but they are not foolish. They will want to understand what happened before they try again." He drank his tea. And when they understand, they will want to talk. Mirai looked up at the sky. What do we say when they do? Taeyeon was quiet for a moment. We say whatever we want to say, because now they will listen. She thought about that. It was a simple thing to say, but it was not a small thing. It was possibly the largest thing that had ever changed in the history of human civilization. Sitting quietly in the middle of a sentence, spoken by a tired man on a cold rooftop in Siberia. And both of them understood it fully, without needing to make it any bigger than it was. They finished their tea. They watched the stars. 6 months later, the conclave sent a diplomatic vessel. It arrived with a formal request for recognition talks. It arrived on time, announced in advance, with proper identification, and a polite request for a meeting location. It was a very different kind of arrival from the last one. Dae-soo met the conclave delegation in a conference room that had been built inside the Chusong, which was now permanently based in orbit. He sat across a wide table from Envoy Vorath, who looked, to the extent that reading a conclave face was possible, like a person who had thought carefully about every word he was about to say. The first thing Vorath said, in careful, slightly formal Korean, that he had clearly learned in the months since the confrontation, was, "We would like to begin again." Dae-soo looked at him for a moment. Then he opened the folder in front of him and picked up a pen. "So would we," he said. And on that day, in a room on a ship that had once been thrown away like garbage by people who had decided it was finished and worthless and beyond saving, the first real conversation between humanity and the Galactic Conclave began. Outside the window, the Earth turned slowly in the dark. Small, blue, and extraordinarily dangerous when underestimated. Just the way it had always been.